We have lived through tumultuous times in South Africa, and those times have produced extraordinary individuals. A generation of such individuals are now at the end of their lives, and each time one of them dies, we are confronted with our loss as citizens of a country made by the actions of those people. Additionally, these moments of mourning and reflection allow us to think about our assessment of those people, in life, and now, in death. Any person's death is of course a full stop to their life. There are no further actions for them to engage in, whether to be praised or criticized, whether to be lionized or vilified for, lauded or denounced. When public figures die, the punctuation of the life also feels public. Personal grief is juxtaposed with public mourning, loss with assessment. Death of the public figure calls for a final assessment of the person's public record, impossible as such finality may well be. In pictures, SAW bids final farewell to Winnie Madikizela Mandela. Across her long life, Nomzamo Winifred Madikizela Mandela was the subject of much public interest, speculation, projection, interpretation, and analysis. Before she had even met Nelson Mandela, with whom she was coupled in the public imaginary for the most of her life, she was the subject of intrigue by the black urban press of Johannesburg. Celebrity and its obverse notoriety came early to the woman the media of the late 1950s called the girl from Pondoland. Much has been written about Winnie Mandela, as she was known for most of her life, over those decades between her arrival in Johannesburg, her marriage to the man who would become the focus of black people's aspiration for freedom from and resistance against white supremacist, Christian nationalist oppression, her internal exile in the Orange Free State, her return to Soweto, her trial for kidnapping, her appearance at the TRC, her reduced political life in later years, and her death at the age of 81. And some of those were her own words in which she made the case for herself. Winnie Madikizela Mandela is one of those litmus tests in Southern Africa, if not the world. Much can be deduced about people's worldviews by how they respond to the mention of her name. Few who know of her, which is different from knowing her, did not and do not still have strong opinions about her, her politics, her role in the history of South Africa, or what they think of as her personality. Most of us have never met her, or so briefly and in circumstances so circumscribed that the real Winnie Madikizela Mandela would always elude us. Only those closest to her will have had the variety of experiences which allow them to have any claim to knowing her, her daughters, siblings, other relatives, and closest comrades. Even her biographers always only had partial access, as biographers do. The woman most of us thought we knew was an amalgam of her own performance of Winnie, the public figure, given the title, Mother of the Nation, and our projections onto and interpretations of such versions of herself as she vouchsafed us. She was newspaper copy, the subject of television news video, and the focus of magazine spreads, the three-dimensional flesh reduced to two dimensions, in words and images. In part of my soul went with him. 1983, Winnie Mandela's story of herself. To us, the public, we get glimpses into a private self, but only insofar as Nomzamo Winifred Madikizela Mandela wants us to see. Autobiography and memoir still require selection of what to tell, and what to keep private, untold. In the later 491 days, prisoner number 1323/69, 2013, Winnie Madikizela Mandela again selects a specific period of her life to recount. Yet millions will claim to know her, and thus to be able to account for her life, in public. These representations of Winnie and the impressions they made have lived with me for more than 30 years. In my mid-20s I became interested in understanding how and why there was such a contrast between public accounts of this woman who was so significant in the politics of South Africa in the second half of the 20th century, and the way in which she was valued by millions of people in South Africa and around the world. How could I make sense of the value she had for people like me, as a figure of resistance learned about in the awareness classes of the UDF in our teenage years, in relation to the public account of her in the Free Society we believed she had helped engender? As a young university teacher in the late 1990s, the coverage around her appearance before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1997 was particularly disturbing. It led me to offer 6 seminars in a second-year feminist course in African literature on gender in South African magazines. The materials were deliberately chosen from newspaper and magazine coverage of the post-apartheid period. The distortions of Stratcom, meant to discredit her in late apartheid South Africa, were excluded precisely to examine how in a post-apartheid dispensation the tropes and stereotypes of the past continued to inform the figurations of the fin de siècle. The daily news coverage photographs of Winnie Madikizela Mandela, as she then became, eclipsing somewhat the Winnie Mandela, whose name we had chanted in youth less than a decade earlier, were juxtaposed with quotations from witness testimony. she was accused of the most brutal actions. The hearings took on an aspect of the spectacle, ending in the figure of Desmond Tutu begging the woman at the heart of the proceedings to make some sort of admission. It was a scene that rankled even those who had not lived through it, had only inherited representations of it in media afterwards. Weekly newspaper of record of the time juxtaposed the testimony of those witnesses, many of them discredited by the police at the time, with an image of Winnie from 1958, wearing her bridal dress. The innocence of the bride contrasted with the blood of children in whose deaths she was alleged to have been implicated. In another cover she was caricatured with demonic eyes. One of the most famous South African cartoonists commented on the TRC hearings with an image of hell, in which a demon supervises Stalin, Hitler, Verwoerd and a simian Idi Amin Dada watching the Winnie trials on television, and one of them suggests she'd make a great deputy president. The editorial of the time even remarked, however reluctantly, on the uncomfortable similarities between the Reign of Terror directed from Orlando East and the evil that flowed out of Black Plaza. Taking students through close analysis of the news coverage from 2 years earlier was not meant to inspire denunciations of the press or those professionals who worked in the media at the time. It was an attempt to get young people to reflect on how meaning is made in the everyday practices of journalists, what tropes and stereotypes they rely on, and how they perpetuate specific understandings of the world through their coverage. In this case, the guilt or innocence of Winnie Madikizela Mandela was not under examination. How post-apartheid journalists represented her, and how the words and images relied on to make meaningful sense of her, reflected older ideas about black women in South Africa. Now, in the wake of her death, we once more have an opportunity for introspection, to think about why we imagine we know what we do about the woman who was such a formidable and powerful figure in the politics of 20th century South Africa. Many people may not want to revise their impressions of her, but all of us would do well to examine the ways in which she was represented in the past, and how those representations shaped our understanding of who she was, and what her role in our political life was. And furthermore, we may wish to unveil the ideas which underpinned those representations, and begin to think critically about how we speak about, write about, and figure women with political power, then and now. For a society as patriarchal and misogynistic as South Africa was then, and as it continues to be now, it may be essential to make sense of our past in relation to this particular woman, not in the interest of hagiography, but in the interest of learning from our history to do better in our present and our future. We owe it to ourselves, if we wish to make a future better than the present and the past. We will never have a final assessment of Nomzamo Winifred Madikizela Mandela. We will never agree on her significance and the meaning of her life. But what we are all afforded in her death is an opportunity to reflect critically on why we think of her as we do, and with what consequences, for ourselves, and this country.